She is just 12 years old. Her wedding dress weighs more than she does. Layers of silk and ermine that smell of lavender and mothballs, stitched by hands that will never know her name. The cathedral echoes with Latin prayers she doesn't understand, spoken by priests who refuse to meet her eyes. Her husband-to-be stands beside her, a man of 23 with pale skin and restless fingers that tap against his sword hilt, like a bird's wing against glass. He hasn't looked at her once, not during the procession when she walked down an aisle longer than her childhood bedroom. Not when the archbishop asked if he would take her as his lawful wife. Not even now, as golden rings slide onto fingers too small to hold the weight of kingdoms. Instead, his gaze drifts constantly to the gallery above, where courtiers watch with painted faces and calculating eyes. She follows his stare and sees a young man with dark hair and darker eyes, who smiles like he knows secrets that could topple thrones. Her new husband smiles back. The expression transforms his face completely, makes it warm and alive in a way that has nothing to do with her. His child bride, his political necessity, his future queen. She tries not to cry. Queens don't cry. Not on their wedding day. Not when the fate of two kingdoms rests on narrow shoulders like a cloak too heavy to bear. But she remembers this moment. She remembers the way he looks at everyone except her. She remembers the taste of tears swallowed behind a painted smile. Because one day, when she's no longer a child playing dress-up in a crown, she'll return. And when she does, she won't just take revenge. She'll take everything. Before we dive into the story of history's most underestimated queen, if you believe the silenced women of the past deserve their voices heard, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. There's something incredible about exploring these buried truths together, connected across time and space by our shared hunger for the stories they tried to erase. Her name is Isabella, and she is the daughter of the most powerful king in Europe, Philip IV of France. They call him Philip the Fair, though his beauty is carved from marble and just as cold. Her childhood has been measured in marriage negotiations, political alliances drawn and redrawn across maps that show kingdoms as game pieces and princesses as pawns to be sacrificed for checkmate. At 12, she speaks 4 languages fluently, can recite the genealogies of every royal house from Scotland to Sicily, and knows which wines pair best with venison and which herbs mask the taste of poison. Her tutors have prepared her for everything except this. Standing in Westminster Abbey as Isabella of France, becomes Isabella of England, queen consort to Edward II, a man who treats her wedding day like a funeral he's been forced to attend. The celebrations that follow are magnificent and hollow. Tournaments where knights fight for a queen who sits alone on her throne. Banquets where toasts are raised to a union that feels more like a business transaction sealed with holy water. Edward performs his duties with mechanical precision, dancing when protocol demands, speaking when conversation requires, smiling when ambassadors are watching. But his smiles never reach his eyes, and his eyes never reach her. The nobles whisper. She pretends not to hear them, but their words follow her through corridors that echo with secrets. The king is distracted. The king has particular friendships. The king's heart lies elsewhere. She learns to read the language of court gossip, the raised eyebrows and meaningful glances that say what tongues dare not speak aloud. Her wedding night passes in silence, broken only by wind rattling the windows of the royal chambers. Edward fulfills his obligation with the same detached efficiency he brings to signing documents, and she lies afterwards staring at tapestries that depict scenes from the courtly romances she once believed might somehow be her life. The irony tastes bitter as tears she's no longer young enough to shed, but she watches, she learns, she waits, because even at 12 she understands something that will serve her well in the years to come. Power rarely announces itself with trumpets and fanfare. Real power moves quietly, like water finding cracks in stone, patient and persistent and utterly destructive when the moment comes to flood. His name is Piers Gaveston, and he moves through her court like a flame through dry kindling, beautiful and dangerous, and utterly consuming. She watches from her throne as he whispers in her husband's ear, watches as Edward's face lights up with laughter that he has never shared with her. Gaveston is everything she is not, tall where she is small, confident where she is uncertain, beloved where she is simply tolerated. Edward showers him with gifts that should have been hers, lands, titles, jewelry that once belonged to Edward's father. Gaveston wears the royal colours, sleeps in chambers adjoining the king's, and speaks to England's nobles as if they were servants in his presence. At state dinners, he sits at Edward's right hand while she, the Queen of England, is relegated to the left. watching her husband feed delicacies to his favorite like a master rewarding a performing dog. The humiliation burns like acid in her chest. When Gaveston mocks the earls with nicknames that reduce proud men to caricatures, calling the Earl of Lancaster the churl and the Earl of Warwick the black dog, she sees how their faces flush with rage, barely contained beneath courtly masks. When he appears at her coronation wearing purple silk encrusted with pearls, outshining even her in magnificence, the silence in Westminster Abbey crackles with tension thick enough to choke on. She tries to find her place in this strange triangle. She smiles when Gaveston tells jokes at her expense. She nods graciously when he presents her with gifts clearly chosen by servants rather than thought. She pretends not to notice when he and Edward disappear for hours into private chambers, or when they return with flushed faces and secrets gleaming in their eyes like fever. But pretending becomes harder when the noble's patience finally shatters, like glass dropped on stone. They cannot touch the king directly, but they can remove the source of their humiliation. In 1312, they capture Gaveston while he shelters in Scarborough Castle, and they execute him on Blacklow Hill with the efficiency of men who have planned every detail in advance. Edward's grief is terrible to witness. He weeps openly, rages at his barons, and locks himself away for weeks that stretch into months. She goes to him once, offering what comfort she can, but he looks at her as if she's a stranger speaking a language he's forgotten how to understand. His eyes are hollow places where love used to live. For a moment, she almost pities him. Almost. Then she remembers every slight, every dismissal, every night spent alone while he shared his bed with another. Her pity calcifies into something harder, something that will serve her better in the years to come. Something that feels remarkably like satisfaction, because now she knows what he looks like when he loses something precious. Now she knows exactly how much damage a broken heart can inflict. And though she doesn't know it yet, she's storing this knowledge like a blade to be sharpened in darkness, waiting for the moment when she'll need to cut deep enough to draw royal blood. The new favorite's name is Hugh Despenser the Younger, and where Gaveston was charming poison, Hugh is pure venom in human form. He slides into the void left by Gaveston's death like a snake into a warm nest, coiling around Edward's loneliness until her husband becomes little more than a puppet dancing to Hugh's tune. Hugh is greed given flesh and dressed in silk. He seizes lands from nobles who dare oppose him, fills his coffers with gold extracted through threats and legal manipulations, and transforms England's court into his personal treasury. But his greatest cruelty is reserved for her. He watches her with pale eyes that catalogue every weakness, every fear, every moment when her mask slips to reveal the woman behind the crown. She realizes too late that he sees her as a threat, not because of anything she's done, but because of what she might become. She is the King of France's daughter, and that bloodline carries weight that could crush kingdoms if properly leveraged. Hugh begins systematically destroying everything that makes her dangerous. First, her friends disappear. Ladies who have served her faithfully for years are suddenly accused of treason, exiled to convents, or married off to distant lords who ensure their silence. Her confessor is replaced by a priest who reports her every word back to Hugh. Her correspondence is read, her movements monitored, her very thoughts treated as potential weapons against the realm. Then he comes for her lands. The dower properties that should provide her income are seized under legal pretexts so thin they wouldn't fool a child. When she protests to Edward, her husband listens with the glazed attention of a man hearing voices from underwater. Hugh stands behind the throne during her audience, and she can see his fingers moving slightly, as if he's manipulating invisible strings attached to Edward's limbs. The final blow comes when they take her son. Prince Edward, her only child, the future king she's raised with careful love and desperate hope, is removed from her care and placed under Hugh's supervision. The official reason is education. He needs masculine influence. They say, guidance from men who understand statecraft and warfare. The real reason hovers in the air like smoke. They want to ensure her boy grows up loyal to Hugh rather than to his mother. She stands in the solar where she once played with her son, surrounded by toys and books that will never again echo with his laughter, and she feels something inside her chest crack open like an egg. The sound that emerges isn't quite a sob and isn't quite a scream. It's the sound a queen makes when she finally understands that she has been reduced to nothing more than an ornament in her own palace. But ornaments can be discarded, and sometimes, when thrown hard enough, they can shatter more than just flaws. Hugh has made one critical error in his campaign to destroy her. He has assumed that because she's been silent, she is weak. Because she's been patient, she is passive. Because she's endured humiliation with grace, she lacks the capacity for rage. He doesn't realize that silence can be a form of gathering strength, that patience can sharpen itself into a blade more deadly than any sword. That grace under pressure is not the mark of a victim, but the discipline of a predator learning exactly when and how to strike. She sails from England in 1325 with the official mission of negotiating peace with her brother, Charles IV of France. It's a diplomatic assignment that Hugh Despenser has orchestrated, believing that distance will further diminish her influence. He thinks exile will render her harmless, a discarded chess piece moved off the board where it can no longer threaten his position. He has never been more wrong about anything in his life. In Paris, she sheds the careful masks she's worn for 13 years like a snake discarding old skin. She speaks French with the fluid grace of someone returning to their native tongue after years of translation. She moves through her brother's court with the confidence of a woman who finally remembers what it feels like to be valued, respected, genuinely welcomed. The French nobles treat her like the queen she's always been in name but never truly in practice. And then she meets Roger Mortimer. He's an exile like her, though his banishment came at sword point rather than through diplomatic maneuvering. Roger escaped from the Tower of London by drugging his guards and scaling walls that were supposed to be unclimbable, fled across England with bloodhounds at his heels, and made his way to France, where he spent 3 years planning his return to reclaim everything Hugh Despenser stole from him. The first time she sees him, he's arguing strategy with a group of French nobles, his hands moving across a map like a conductor directing an orchestra of destruction. His hair is dark shot through with premature silver, his face bears scars from battles that would have killed lesser men, and his eyes hold the kind of focused intensity that suggests he's already fighting wars in his mind. When he looks at her, really looks at her, she feels seen for the first time in over a decade. Roger doesn't see a diplomatic pawn or a decorative ornament. He sees Isabella of France, daughter of kings, mother of the future king, and a woman whose righteous fury could burn down kingdoms if properly channeled. When she tells him about Hugh's systematic destruction of her power, about her son held hostage, about her husband's spineless capitulation to his favorite's greed, Roger listens with the attention of a general receiving intelligence reports from behind enemy lines. "You want your son back," he says. "It's not a question. I want everything back." Everything means removing Hugh Despenser, and anyone who stands with him. Roger smiles, and the expression transforms his scarred face into something beautiful and terrible. Then we understand each other perfectly. What grows between them isn't the courtly love of troubadour songs or the political marriage she's known with Edward. It's something raw and more dangerous, a partnership forged in mutual recognition of each other's capacity for calculated revenge. They share beds and battle plans with equal passion, mapping invasions by candlelight and whispering strategies between kisses that taste like wine and warfare. Together, they build an army not just of soldiers, but of exiled nobles, dispossessed knights, and merchants who've suffered under Hugh's taxation. Her brother provides gold and ships. Roger provides military expertise and contacts throughout England who remember what life was like before Hugh Despenser turned the kingdom into his personal treasury. She provides the one thing that transforms a rebellion into a legitimate cause: royal blood and a mother's fury at having her child stolen. By the autumn of 1326, she's ready. Her ships wait in French harbors, loaded with men and weapons and the accumulated rage of everyone Hugh has wronged. Her son, now 14 and old enough to understand what's at stake, joins her cause with an enthusiasm that would terrify his father if Edward were capable of seeing past Hugh's manipulations. She stands on the deck of her flagship as the English coast appears through morning mist, and she's no longer the frightened child who once wore a wedding dress too big for her body. She's a queen with an army, a mother with a mission, and a woman who has learned that sometimes the only way to reclaim what's yours is to burn down everything standing in the way. The game that began with her wedding day humiliation is about to reach its endgame, and this time, she's not a pawn being moved by other hands. She's the player, and she intends to win. She lands at Harwich on the 24th of September, 1326, with an army of 700 men and the fury of 13 years channeled into singular purpose. The beach where she first sets foot on English soil after exile is grey shingle and bitter wind, but it might as well be consecrated ground for how it feels beneath her boots. Every step forward is a step toward reclaiming what was stolen from her: her son, her power, her dignity, her very self. The speed of her triumph would be shocking if it weren't so inevitable. England has been bleeding under Hugh Despenser's rule, and her invasion isn't conquest so much as surgery. cutting away the diseased tissue that's been poisoning the kingdom's body. Town after town opens its gates to her without siege or battle. Nobles who've hidden their hatred behind forced smiles for years declare openly for her cause. Even the church, that most conservative of institutions, welcomes her return as divine justice. Edward and the Despensers flee London like rats abandoning a burning ship. She enters the capital in triumph, riding through streets lined with cheering crowds who throw flowers at her horse's hooves and call down blessings on her head. After years of being treated as an unwelcome guest in her own palace, she's welcomed home by her people with a joy that feels like vindication made manifest. But justice delayed is not justice denied, and she's had years to plan exactly what form her vengeance will take. The hunt begins immediately. Her agents spread across England like blood through water, tracking every movement of the fleeing king and his favorites. Edward proves as incompetent at escape as he was at ruling, leaving a trail of witnesses and abandoned belongings that makes following him simpler than tracking a wounded deer through snow. Within weeks, she's cornered them in Wales, that wild country where Edward's grandfather once conquered princes and claimed dominion over the Celtic fringe. The irony is exquisite. Edward Longshanks, who styled himself Hammer of the Welsh, would find his descendant captured and humiliated in the very lands he once conquered. Hugh Despenser the Elder is caught first, dragged before her in chains that clink like church bells announcing Judgment Day. This old man who enabled his son's cruelties stands before her throne with defiance crumbling into terror as he realizes that mercy isn't part of her vocabulary. His execution is swift but public, a message to anyone who might still harbor illusions about her intentions. But Hugh the Younger is the prize she's truly hunted, and when her men finally bring him before her, the moment tastes sweeter than wine aged in victory's cellar. This man who humiliated her, who stole her lands, who poisoned her marriage and kidnapped her child, now kneels in the mud wearing chains heavy enough to anchor ships. He begs. Of course he begs. Men like Hugh always beg when the power they've abused is finally turned against them. He offers her gold, lands, political alliances, anything that might purchase reprieve from the justice he's earned through years of calculated cruelty. His voice cracks as he speaks, and she can smell the fierce sweat soaking through his silk clothes. She lets him finish his pathetic litany of bribes and promises. She lets the silence stretch until it becomes a living thing coiled in the air between them. Then she speaks, and her voice carries the accumulated weight of every slight, every humiliation, every night she spent alone while he whispered poison in her husband's ear. Did you show mercy to the men whose lands you seized? Did you offer comfort to the women whose husbands you destroyed? Did you spare a thought for the queen whose life you systematically dismantled? Hugh's execution is a masterpiece of symbolic justice. Drawn and quartered in the public square, his body broken as thoroughly as he broke England's peace. The crowd roars its approval with voices hoarse from cheering, and she watches from her balcony with the satisfied attention of an artist admiring a completed work. When they bring her his severed head, she doesn't flinch. Instead, she studies the face that once sneered at her across council tables, now reduced to meat and bone and the eternal silence of the grave. This is what happens to men who mistake queens for ornaments, who confuse patience with weakness, who forget that even the gentlest lamb can grow fangs when her cubs are threatened. The message spreads across England faster than wildfire. Isabella of France has returned, and she is nobody's victim anymore. Her husband is the last piece to be captured, and when they finally drag him before her at Kenilworth Castle, Edward II looks nothing like the young man who once ignored her at their wedding. Prison has aged him decades in months, turning his hair grey and carving lines of defeat into his face like a sculptor working in despair. He can't meet her eyes, this man who once wore a crown and commanded kingdoms, reduced now to a trembling shadow of royal authority. But she's learned that pity is a luxury queens can't afford, especially when dealing with kings who've forgotten how to rule anything except their own appetites. The abdication ceremony is a masterpiece of political theatre, each detail calculated to emphasize the transfer of legitimate power from a failed king to his rightful heir. Edward signs the documents that end his reign with shaking hands, his signature barely legible through tears that he no longer has the strength to hide. The great seal that once validated his commands is formally broken, its pieces scattered like fragments of a dynasty that died from internal rot rather than external conquest. Her son, 14 years old and every inch the prince his father never managed to be, accepts the crown with a gravity that would be heartbreaking if it weren't so necessary. Edward III kneels to receive the symbols of kingship while his father watches from the shadows, a living ghost haunting the ceremony that marks his political death. She rules as regent, of course. Her son may wear the crown, but she wields the power with skills honed through years of observation and exile. The kingdom that was bleeding under Hugh Despencer's mismanagement begins to heal under her guidance. Laws are reformed, corruption is purged, and England remembers what competent governance feels like when it's not filtered through the lens of royal favorites and their pet obsessions. The deposed king is moved to Berkeley Castle, that grim fortress in Gloucestershire, where the walls are thick enough to muffle screams and the dungeons deep enough to swallow inconvenient truths. Edward II disappears into those stones like a man sinking into dark water, and what happens next becomes one of history's most persistent mysteries. On the 21st of September, 1327, messengers arrive at court with news that settles over the assembled nobles, like fog rolling in from the sea. The former king is dead. The official cause is illness, that conveniently vague explanation that covers everything from genuine disease to more deliberate forms of mortality. But rumors follow the announcement like vultures trailing an army. Whispers of red-hot pokers and screams that echoed through castle corridors on a night when the moon hid behind clouds, as if even celestial bodies couldn't bear to witness what transpired in that chamber. She receives the news with the composed dignity expected of a regent and mother, her face revealing nothing more than appropriate sorrow for a life ended too soon. But privately, in the darkness of her own chambers, she wonders if this is what justice feels like. Not triumph exactly, but the hollow satisfaction of watching a long overdue debt finally paid in full. Edward II is dead. Hugh Despencer is dead. England is healing under her guidance, and her son grows daily into the kind of king his father never managed to become. The girl who once stood trembling in a wedding dress too large for her body has become a woman who reshapes kingdoms with the same casual efficiency other people use to rearrange furniture. But power, as she's about to discover, is not a possession to be owned, but a river to be navigated. And even the most skilled swimmers can find themselves swept away by currents they failed to anticipate. For 3 years, she rules England through her son, with the competence that eluded her husband throughout his entire reign. The kingdom prospers under her guidance. Wars are won, alliances are forged, and the nobility learns to respect a regent who combines political acumen with the kind of steely determination that transforms intentions into accomplished facts. But power shared is power vulnerable, and Roger Mortimer begins to forget that he owes his position to their partnership rather than his own inherent right to rule. Success breeds its own form of corruption, and the man who once helped her reclaim her kingdom starts to behave uncomfortably like the favorites who destroyed her marriage. He awards himself new titles, seizes lands with the same casual arrogance Hugh Despencer once displayed. And worst of all, he begins making decisions without consulting her. The partnership that once felt like two blades perfectly balanced becomes something more like a dance, where one partner keeps trying to lead while the other is still learning the steps. Roger grows arrogant in victory, surrounding himself with men whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned, making enemies of nobles who should have been allies. The same pattern that destroyed Edward II begins to repeat itself with sickening familiarity. Her son watches these developments with the calculating intelligence he inherited from her bloodline rather than his father's. Edward III has been studying the lessons of kingship, not from books, but from observing how power flows between the adults who claim to serve him while pursuing their own ambitions. At 18, he's old enough to understand that a king controlled by regents is not truly a king at all. The coup, when it comes, unfolds with the swift efficiency of youth striking against experience grown complacent. Edward III moves against Mortimer at Nottingham Castle in October 1330, catching her lover completely off guard. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so tragic. The man who once escaped from the Tower of London through brilliant planning and perfect execution is captured in his own chambers like a common criminal, victim of the same overconfidence that has toppled greater men. Roger's trial and execution follow with mechanical inevitability. The charges are treason, usurpation of royal authority, and the accumulated crimes of 3 years spent treating England as his personal treasure chest. He dies at Tyburn like a common criminal, his body left hanging as a reminder that even the closest advisors to power are still subject to its ultimate judgment. She survives because she is the king's mother, because her bloodline carries diplomatic value, and perhaps because her son recognizes that her competence as a regent, however inconvenient, was genuine rather than parasitic. But survival comes at the price of political death, a form of execution more subtle than the scaffold but no less final. Her lands are confiscated, her household dissolved, her influence reduced to whatever conversations she can manage during carefully supervised visits with a son who now sees her more as a potential threat than as the mother who once fought kingdoms to rescue him from Hugh Despenser's influence. The woman who overthrew kings is herself overthrown by the king she raised, victim of the same political mathematics that has governed every move in this deadly game. They send her to Castle Rising in Norfolk, that comfortable but remote prison where inconvenient royal women are deposited when they become too dangerous for court, but too valuable for execution. The castle is pleasant enough, with gardens for walking and chambers filled with books that help pass the hours between visits from officials who monitor her correspondence and ensure her continued irrelevance. But irrelevance, she discovers, has its own strange peace. For the first time since her wedding day, she belongs to no one except herself. She lives for 28 more years after her fall from power, watching from her comfortable exile as her son becomes the king she always knew he could be. Edward III transforms England into a military powerhouse that conquers French territories her father's kingdom could never successfully defend. The boy she fought so desperately to rescue grows into a man who vindicates every sacrifice she made in the pursuit of his throne. History will remember her by many names: Isabella of France, the She-Wolf, the queen who overthrew a king. But in the quiet chambers of Castle Rising, surrounded by books and memories and the accumulated weight of a life lived at the intersection of love and power, she remembers herself differently. She remembers the 12-year-old girl in a wedding dress too large for her body, trying not to cry as she married a stranger who couldn't be bothered to look at her on what should have been the most important day of her life. That girl learned hard lessons about the nature of power and the price of survival. She learned that patience can be more deadly than poison when properly applied. She learned that silence is not the same as acceptance, that grace under pressure is not weakness, but the discipline of a predator choosing the perfect moment to strike. Most importantly, she learned that love, whether romantic, maternal, or the simple love of justice, can be transformed into the most terrible weapon of all when wielded by someone who has nothing left to lose. Her story unfolds across decades like a tapestry woven from golden thread and blood, beautiful from a distance but revealing its true cost only when examined closely. She was a pawn who learned to play the game, a victim who became a victor, a queen who discovered that crowns are won not through birthright alone but through the willingness to do whatever survival demands. The girl in the wedding dress dreamed of love. The woman who overthrew kingdoms learned that sometimes love means choosing between heart and child's future, between personal happiness and political necessity, between the person she was and the person she must become to protect what matters most. When she dies in 1358 at age 63, she's buried in the Franciscan church at Newgate, her tomb adorned with the lilies of France and the lions of England, symbols of the bloodlines that shaped her destiny and the kingdoms she reshaped through will and cunning, and the accumulated fury of wrongs that demanded redress. The inscription speaks of piety and nobility, the conventional language of royal memorials that transforms complex lives into simplified virtues. But those who knew her, who watched her navigate the treacherous currents of medieval politics with the skill of someone born to rule rather than merely reign, remember something different. They remember the queen who proved that even the gentlest lamb can grow fangs when her cubs are threatened. They remember the woman who demonstrated that patience is not passivity but preparation, that silence is not submission but the gathering of strength for the moment when words become unnecessary. They remember the girl who was married at 12, ignored for years, humiliated by her husband's favorites, and systematically stripped of everything that should have been hers by right of birth and marriage. They remember how that girl transformed herself into something harder and sharper and infinitely more dangerous than anyone expected. She was called the She-Wolf of France, and the name was meant as an insult, a way of reducing her achievements to animal savagery, rather than recognizing the brilliant political intelligence that made her victories possible. But wolves, as she learned during her years of exile and planning, are not merely savage. They are patient hunters who understand pack dynamics, who can wait motionless for hours before striking with perfect precision, who protect their young with a ferocity that transforms love into the deadliest force in nature. The wedding dress that once seemed too large for her 12-year-old body proved to be perfectly sized after all. She simply had to grow into it, had to become the queen it was designed for, rather than remaining the child who first wore its weight. The crown that seemed impossibly heavy on her young head became comfortable once she understood that its true weight came not from gold and jewels, but from the responsibility of wielding power in service of justice. In the end, that's what her story teaches us, that queens are not born but forged, that power is not inherited but earned, and that sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply becoming everything enemies never believed she could be. The girl who cried behind her wedding veil grew into the woman who reshaped the map of Europe through maternal love transmuted into political gold. They called her a she-wolf, but they never asked what made her learn to bite.